Tonight on Nova.
We're having an earthquake. Relax.
911. What is going on? Earthquake. Coming from, I can't see anything. Listen to me. Calm down.
Is there somebody in there?
A kitty, just a kitty.
Recent quakes in Southern California are revealing unexpected new dangers.
The ground is moving in so many places all at once. This can't be real.
Is downtown LA at ground zero for the next killer quake?
Funding for Nova is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership.
And by Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
Major funding for Nova is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
All you need to know. KNX 1070 News Radio.
Good morning. The time is 4:30 on Monday, January 17th. And these are the places where there's news. Washington, the nation.
It was clear and peaceful in Los Angeles during the pre-dawn hours of January 17th, 1994. Most of the city was asleep. Today was a holiday, the end of a 3-day weekend, a chance to relax. But on this particular Monday, the Earth had something else in mind.
The White House, President Clinton.
It's an earthquake. We're having an earthquake. Relax. Just stay right here. We're having an earthquake. Relax.
911. What is going on? Earthquake.
Okay, and this is Jay Lawrence with radio station KFI. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've just... what I can say is we just experienced a real whopper here, especially here at the radio station. We're trying to piece everything together. What I can say is Los Angeles apparently just had a major trembler.
So major, this quake would suddenly prompt local residents and scientists around the world to reassess their beliefs about the extent of earthquake danger to Los Angeles. But no one was thinking about that right now. They were just trying to survive.
Don't bend your legs. Fire and paramedics. I can't see anything. Listen to me. Calm down. Okay, calm down because the fire department will come out, okay? Hold on a second.
It's an earthquake and I'm in my house. It's falling apart. I have the doors. I don't know what to do.
Ma'am, just stay calm.
I need the fire department in my apartment. The water's coming out to the back room. Some pipes get loose or something and hot water's
Okay, sir, the fire department does not handle that. You'll have to go out and turn the water off at the main.
Powerful shock waves snapped gas lines, igniting a series of fires. Pipes ruptured, creating an eerie dance of water and fire. Entire neighborhoods were deluged, and firefighters lacked water pressure badly needed to fight fires. Thousands of people fled their homes.
All units be advised, we have sustained a major earthquake in the LA basin. All unit battalions report on Blue 4.
Emergency teams combed neighborhoods to make sure no one was left behind. At first, the damage appeared to be confined to a single section of Los Angeles known as the San Fernando Valley, some 20 miles northwest of downtown.
It was reported the 10th freeway buckled or collapsed at Fairfax. Refrain from using the 10th freeway in either direction.
But then word came that sections of 5 separate freeways in different parts of the city had collapsed.
I am southbound on the 5.
Driving with his personal video camera, Jack Noyes chronicled the chaos.
and there's traffic in the southbound lanes coming at me in the #1 lane. And there's traffic. I've just taken a hit. There's a break in the road. There's traffic coming at me in the southbound lane. I'm in shock.
Across town in Hollywood, the quake had crumbled dozens of older brick buildings, forcing residents into the streets. Throughout LA's vast metropolitan area, power lines were ripped down, leaving millions of people isolated without lights or electricity.
Number 6, kids, please! Is there somebody in there? A kitty, just a kitty!
Fire paramedics.
I got people stuck trapped in the stockroom. The whole shelf came down. I got 2 girls stuck right now.
All right, calm down. Give me the address.
The nature of the problem?
She's having her second heart attack. She's 80 years old and she's not breathing.
Has the baby been born yet?
No, it has not.
What is your telephone number you're calling?
As dawn approached, the full impact of Quake's rampage became shockingly clear.
There's a little hole right through here, man.
Are you in a car?
He sounds like he's right here.
Sounds like he's right here.
Sounds like he's right.
Hey, we're coming.
Rescue crews combed the city looking for people trapped in the rubble.
I think he's right below you, Jerry.
I think he's right here. Yeah, I couldn't tell.
Pinned inside a collapsed parking garage was Salvador Pena, who had been driving a street sweeper underneath. Buried by broken slabs of concrete, he was still alive. Rescue teams could barely keep up with the damage that seemed to be spreading in all directions. From the San Fernando Valley, the earthquake had apparently traveled under an entire mountain range, devastating buildings in Santa Monica, 18 miles to the south. But the path of damage that seemed to encompass much of the city left little clue as to where the quake had been centered. Damage reports continued to pour in from every section of town. 9 freeway bridges were in shambles. And the full extent of the damage continued catching rescue teams by surprise. Further up the road, the quake's furious stampede had even more serious consequences. Along an interchange of the Golden State Freeway just outside Northridge, the earthquake sheared off 4 overpasses. Here, one of the day's first fatalities was discovered. A Los Angeles police motorcycle officer was killed when his cycle flew off the collapsed overpass. He was on his way to work.
This is KNX Los Angeles.
Okay, we are getting some preliminary information here. This is a 6.5, struck at 4:31. This, according to Dr. Lucy Jones at the Caltech Seismology Lab. These are preliminary. Yeah, go ahead.
She's not sure of a location, but she thinks that it may be in the San Fernando Valley.
Somewhere in the San Fernando Valley for a possible epicenter, which, of course, is POW, right in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles city limits.
By now, the media was searching for answers. Reporters converged on the California Institute of Technology, one of the world's leading earthquake research centers. But scientists there were in the dark. The earthquake was so powerful, it overwhelmed the computer system that monitored the scientists' ground sensors. For the moment, information that would reveal the exact location of the earthquake was unavailable to seismologists like Lucy Jones.
The waves from it came up and hit a lot of our stations at almost the same time. And it fit the pattern for microwave noise. Basically, the computer said, the ground is moving in so many places all at once. This can't be real. This must be a glitch in the microwave system, and threw it out. So when we got in there, instead of coming up with a location like we would hope to do, we often get a location within 2 minutes. Instead, we had the system saying, oh, nothing's happened. Well, yes, there was a bit of noise in the system, nothing's happened, and we had to retrieve it.
Oh my gosh.
But clues were emerging in the form of aftershocks.
Okay, come on back, come on back, come on.
Dozens of mini earthquakes shook the city, kicking up dust storms in the mountains and valleys.
The one time we do know when an earthquake's going to happen is immediately after a big event. We know there are going to be aftershocks. Aftershocks are earthquakes. It's our one chance to get our instruments out before the earthquake happens.
The dust storms created by the aftershocks continued all morning, but each tremor provided the Caltech team with a visible trail to find the source of the earthquake.
By getting the location of the aftershocks very, very exactly, we can see the details of the fault that produced the earthquakes. And we had 10 technicians in the field within 2 hours after the earthquake, because if we didn't, we'd have missed the events.
By early morning, seismologists had finally retrieved the data that their computers had recorded at the time of the earthquake. This information confirmed what the aftershocks had been suggesting. The source of the earthquake, the epicenter, was in the San Fernando Valley directly under a community known as Northridge, some 23 miles northwest of downtown. Caltech geologist Jim Dolan was among the first to fly over the epicenter to survey the scene.
The morning of the earthquake, we went up in a helicopter to try to find surface rupture, which helps us greatly in understanding which fault broke in the earthquake, which we were trying to determine the day of the earthquake. So we went up in the helicopter and spent several hours flying around the epicentral area and the area to the north, trying to find surface rupture.
Most earthquakes leave a gash in the Earth's crust, a path of destruction that reveals the location of the underlying fault that caused the earthquake. But this was no ordinary earthquake. Dolan couldn't find any surface rupture to trace the Earth's movement, nor did he have any idea about which fault had triggered the event.
It's one of those unfortunate instances where we had to have an earthquake to find out where the fault that broke in the earthquake was. We didn't know that the fault that broke in the Northridge earthquake existed before the earthquake.
But the widespread damage Dolan saw left little doubt that Northridge was indeed the center of the earthquake. One strong piece of evidence was this large multi-unit apartment complex called the Northridge Meadows.
Hello?
It was originally a 3-story building. Now it was 2.
Wait a minute. Hold up. You underneath that? Okay, he's right underneath here.
Trapped inside and underneath were dozens of residents. Ultimately, 16 of the earthquake's 57 dead would be found in the rubble of this one building.
We were laying in bed and someone broke a window and we just managed to crawl out.
And I went to sit up, to get up, and I realized the ceiling was on my head.
I climbed down the balcony. I grabbed my wife, ran like heck to the center of the complex.
And I was wedged between my mattress and the wall. And the mattress was up in the air and I couldn't figure out what it was doing there, why I couldn't push it back down.
Got thrown out of bed, run downstairs. It was running through glass that we didn't know was there.
There is no first floor anymore, it's gone.
I think I was in shock. And I tell you the truth, had I not been knocked unconscious, I think I might have died of a heart attack. It was that frightening.
You got a drop bag and all that? Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, glad we could help.
You guys did that as me yesterday.
Yes. You're welcome. Right up here, guys. We're gonna lay him down.
Just a few miles away from the Northridge Meadows apartments, rescue crews continued their struggle to pry Salvador Pena from the collapsed parking garage.
Right up here, guys. We're gonna lay him down. Right up here.
Finally, after 4 hours, he was pulled out. He was seriously injured but alive and would eventually recover.
Everyone's initially very frightened, and then once the shock starts wearing off, you really want to know what happened. It's a very schizophrenic experience, a large earthquake. It's a very schizophrenic experience for a geologist or a seismologist who works on earthquakes, because on the one hand, the amount of energy that's involved in moving a chunk of the Earth's crust 10 miles thick, moving that thing 20 feet in a couple of seconds is mind-boggling, and it's extraordinarily fascinating. That's why we work on earthquakes, because they are so fascinating. On the other hand, when you're up in a helicopter flying around over Northridge the morning of the earthquake, looking at, derailed trains, buildings on fire, apartment buildings that have collapsed and obviously killed people, on a completely different level, on a human level, it's a devastating experience. So we're constantly trying to balance these two reactions to an earthquake.
Everywhere Jim Dolan looked that January morning, he saw destruction, but there was no rupture in the Earth's crust. After searching in vain for a telltale crack in the ground, Dolan knew its absence only meant one thing. The earthquake was the work of a blind thrust fault. A fault that can't be seen. When it ruptures, it never breaks the Earth's surface. The Northridge shock started deep underground. But unlike most earthquakes, it stopped 5 miles below. Yet the quake was just as destructive, despite its unusual behavior.
So it was much more difficult in the day or two after the earthquake to understand what had happened, because it's very easy to go out and see a road that's offset in an earthquake. It's much more difficult to understand something that happened 10 miles deep.
The Northridge blind thrust had taken only 6 seconds to release its deadly energy, but it would take the city months, perhaps years, to recover. It was one of the most expensive natural disasters in the nation's history. For the moment, many anxious residents were merely thankful they were not among the 57 who died, or the 9,000 injured. By nightfall, as thousands of anxious residents huddled around campfires, many were left to wonder, was this earthquake the big one? The long-awaited seismic disaster all Californians had been warned to expect. Or would earthquakes like it strike again, perhaps even more violently than it had today?
I think Northridge was an excellent wake-up call, showing us once again, we're going to have damaging earthquakes in Los Angeles, and at some point, it's going to affect everyone in Los Angeles. Everyone needs to be prepared for the possibility of a major earthquake occurring in Los Angeles at any time. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know where it's going to happen. We do know it will happen.
That wake-up call was all the more disturbing because throughout its history, Los Angeles has seen relatively few earthquakes. In recent memory, only occasional moderate shocks have troubled the city, which grew rapidly to become the capital of the entertainment industry. In 1933, with cameras rolling for a W.C. Fields feature, Hollywood captured one of the city's first major earthquakes on film.
Man, you probably saved my life. Now what can I do for you? Take us to Shanghai. Shanghai? Yeah. What's the matter? Earthquake. Take your time, folks. Now, everybody walk easy. It's all right now. It's all right. All right, okay. Everybody.
What shook up W.C. Fields was an earthquake centered in Long Beach, 21 miles south of downtown. It was the first time in modern Los Angeles history that a deadly earthquake had come so near. And the city was caught off guard. With no building codes in place, the moderate quake killed 115 people and nearly destroyed downtown Long Beach. This tremor was the first indication that Los Angeles itself might sit on an active earthquake zone. Yet even after the disaster, most seismologists of the day tended to downplay the local earthquake risk. And for the next 40 years, Los Angeles enjoyed a respite from earthquakes. The city boomed during the post-war years, with no distractions from earthquakes. Subdivisions and shopping centers stretched across the land, especially in the area known as the San Fernando Valley.
Notice the attractive curved streets and the convenient commercial area.
The only seismic hazard people worried about, and they didn't worry very much, was the San Andreas Fault, which passes Los Angeles in the desert some 60 miles away from downtown. The San Andreas Fault is really an 800-mile-long crack that divides two huge chunks of the Earth's crust called plates. The North American plate lies to the east, under San Francisco, while the Pacific plate on the west lies beneath Los Angeles.
Los Angeles is sitting on the Pacific Ocean plate, and it's being moved to the northwest compared to North America at a rate of just under a couple of inches a year. It's about the same rate that your fingernails grow. And in 5 to 10 million years, we're going to have Los Angeles as a suburb of San Francisco, or San Francisco as a suburb of Los Angeles, depending on your point of view. And in 50 million years or so, we'll be actually heading up into Alaska, giving up on our palm trees.
These plates move by each other in a north-south direction. But sometimes the plates don't slide so smoothly. The San Andreas is known as a strike-slip fault because the plates bump and grind as they attempt to move in opposite directions.
It's the grinding, it's the slow, inexorable grinding of these two plates past one another that causes earthquakes. They stick in places. And when they stick, you build up strain because the plates on either side continue moving. It sticks, eventually it'll snap loose, and that's an earthquake.
It can take hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years for strain to build up before an earthquake erupts. Sometimes it's released all at once in one large quake. Other times it's released in a series of smaller shocks. It's a phenomenon that Ross Stein, a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey, illustrates with a simple experiment.
What you're looking at here is everything I know about earthquakes. And this really isn't as embarrassing an admission as it sounds, because really in this simple experiment, all of the behavior that we see in earthquakes is replicated. Now, what is the earthquake machine? It's this machine that is driven by steady motion of the plate's interiors, which is represented in this experiment by this winch, which I just crank steadily. It's got the elasticity of the Earth's crust. It's actually rubbery. It's pretty stiff, but it's rubbery. And it's got some mass that's in frictional contact with the surface. That's the fall. So by steadily loading up this system, I'm increasing the force on the brick. Okay, what just happened? We had an earthquake. Keep watching. And as the spring gets pulled in here, we're bringing up the loads again on the brick. So we've had a second earthquake. We'll let it go one more time. Okay. Now, were all these earthquakes of the same size? No, it's incredible. I can't create a situation that's any simpler than this, and undoubtedly the Earth is more complicated.
The magnitude or power of an earthquake is determined by the distance over which it erupts and the duration of shaking. Earthquakes are rated on a sliding scale. Larger quakes are rated magnitude 7 or higher and release their stress all at once, while moderate earthquakes tend to occur more frequently, relieving stress over time. In 1906, a major jolt along the northern 270 miles of the San Andreas Fault produced the magnitude 7.7 San Francisco earthquake. The city shook for nearly 60 seconds. The earthquake released 32 times more energy than the Northridge quake. The shock waves were felt from Oregon to Nevada. When it was over, the city was nearly leveled. Much of what didn't crumble burned to the ground. Over 2,000 people lost their lives. But the southern portion of the San Andreas has experienced no such violent movement in recent memory. Although the mighty fault doesn't run directly under Los Angeles, anxious residents have assumed this was the fault that would bring the long-awaited big one to Southern California. But that thinking has begun to shift.
The fact that the San Andreas knocks off a magnitude 7.5 or 8 earthquake every 100 years or so means we can't ignore it. However, what's new in the thinking is that the San Andreas, when it comes to Los Angeles, is out there 50 kilometers to the north. So the San Andreas is not underneath us, and what we've discovered is that when you are very close to a fault that ruptures an earthquake, you experience some very strong shaking, which is not the same as what you'll get even from a large earthquake at greater distance. And in addition, we've discovered, to our regret, that there are lots of active faults directly beneath the populated centers, which are capable of producing moderate to large earthquakes, larger earthquakes than we ever expected a decade ago.
As it turns out, there's a direct link between the San Andreas and all those faults under Los Angeles. Throughout most of its 800-mile journey, the San Andreas runs a straight course, but just north of Los Angeles, the fault takes a sudden turn. At this bend, the Pacific Plate and the North American plates no longer slide past one another, but actually collide head-on. Over millions of years, the constant banging at the bend has cracked the plate underlying Los Angeles into tiny pieces, creating a network of smaller faults that resemble a shattered pane of glass.
And because of that bend, all of the essentially broken shards of glass that makes up Southern California are being shoved up against a wall rather than just swept past it. And as they stack up against each other, these little pieces get jammed on top of each other. Some get pushed down, some get pushed up. We call that thrust faulting.
The collision of the two plates has compressed the ground under Los Angeles as though it were being squeezed in a giant vise. Every so often, the compression reaches a point where it forces one piece of earth to slide over another. The ground above has nowhere to go but up, and the result is an earthquake. Over time, the thrust faults that produce these earthquakes have given shape to California's scenery.
Earthquakes are what make California so wonderful. Whenever you see mountains in California, basically you should be thinking earthquakes, because there are probably faults pushing those mountains up. They have created all of our scenery, and what give us our mountains, our valleys, most of our water sources. Our springs all form up along fault lines, and we'd look like Kansas if we didn't have our faults and our earthquakes. It'd be a much flatter topography.
In the hills overlooking Los Angeles, geophysicist Andrea Donnellan is actually able to measure how much the Earth moves because of all this compression. For the first time, scientists can know the extent to which LA's landscape is being squeezed. And from that, they can then gauge how much strain is being put on the thrust faults deep underground. Someday, this information may provide clues about when and where LA's next earthquake may occur. Several years ago, Donnellan and her colleagues began setting up tiny antennas in various sites around Los Angeles to receive signals from orbiting satellites. Donnellan regularly monitors the position of those satellites relative to her receivers on the ground. After making some simple calculations, she can determine if the distance between the receivers has changed. Recently, Donnellan has witnessed her receivers inching closer together.
Ready?
The land is shrinking, perhaps a warning that more pressure is mounting along the thrust faults.
We know the LA basin is shortening. We don't know where it's shortening or what faults are taking up that motion. If the strains are very high, if the Earth is moving very quickly, then we suspect that there's something going on. We know there's active tectonic deformation, and then we try to figure out what faults are responsible for that.
This approach has already come close to forecasting one earthquake. In 1987, Donnellan and her colleagues began detecting pressure building in the mountains northwest of Los Angeles. For 6 years, the strain intensified. It looked like the region might be cranking up for an earthquake.
749-ish high.
2 months before the Northridge earthquake erupted, she and her partners forecast a magnitude 6.4 event in the mountains northwest of downtown. Northridge was part of that area.
It looked like it was ready to snap because the strain was so high, which again means stress is building up, and also because there hadn't been an earthquake. And since the recurrence interval on these faults is 200 to 500 years, there hadn't been an earthquake in 200 years. We knew the earthquake could happen tomorrow or January 17th, or it could happen a century from now. We aren't sure, but it seemed as ripe as any area in Southern California to break.
After the Northridge quake, Donnellan used the satellites to confirm that the thrust faults had actually lifted the land. The Northridge shock buckled the ground upward, adding over 1 foot to the mountains surrounding the northern edge of the city. Most of the mountains that ring Los Angeles contain active thrust faults. Until recently, these mountains, or folds as geologists call them, were thought to grow very slowly, perhaps only a few millimeters every century. But 2 recent earthquakes called that into question.
A couple of earthquakes dramatically changed our mind. In 1980, there was a magnitude 7.3 earthquake in Algeria at a place called El Asnam. What happened in that earthquake was we had one of these dipping faults, and we actually saw the fold forming above this fault grow as much as 15 feet during this earthquake. And it was very clear from this earthquake that folds did not always grow slowly by creeping up. And in fact, they could grow episodically in jumps during really big earthquakes. That point was hammered home 3 years later by the 1983 Coalinga earthquake in Central California.
Located halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, the small town of Coalinga was virtually destroyed by a moderate-sized earthquake. It was triggered by a thrust fault close to the center of town. Coalinga is located in a valley surrounded by gentle hills. During the earthquake, the land jumped 2 feet and 3/4 of the town's buildings came down.
There were people buried underneath the rubble. We know that for a fact. It seems at this point that most have been pulled out, but no one at the scene seems to know exactly how many people were injured. You can see the utter devastation. This is all downtown Coalinga, the very center of Coalinga.
That was an earthquake of magnitude 6.5, essentially the same size as Northridge, in an area where nobody thought a large earthquake could occur. It was on a blind thrust fault.
This was the first time that a blind thrust fault caused major earthquake damage in California. When the fault erupted, it never broke the Earth's surface and couldn't be seen beneath the hills or folds outside of town.
So the fault's down here, the fold's above it. The only thing we see at the surface is the fold. We didn't see the fault. People did not appreciate this as a seismic hazard.
The Coalinga quake so took scientists by surprise that they didn't react immediately to its message.
At that time, a decade ago, the handwriting was on the wall. We should have fanned out in all directions and started hunting for these faults. We did so in a limited sense, and we began to realize that large earthquakes could occur underneath areas where there wasn't a fault at the surface, and of course Northridge is the most recent example of that.
So blind thrust faults could be hiding virtually anywhere. When there's no break in the Earth's surface, there are few clues for the geologists who study earthquakes to investigate. So is there any way to find these faults before an earthquake occurs? It turns out that other geologists, those who look for oil, have been studying the Earth's layers under Southern California for decades. Before Los Angeles was densely populated, petroleum geologists scoured the city in search of oil, sending down shock waves and producing hundreds of seismic maps of the Earth's crust. For years, oil geologists have known that petroleum was trapped in pools underneath land that had folded into gentle hills.
been a lot of oil prospecting in California, particularly in the LA basin, in urban LA, produced billions of barrels of oil. That actually was good news. If you think about it, oil's less dense than water. It's going to flow up as high as it can go, and it'll typically flow up into the core of these folds, which we call anticlines.
Those hills filled with oil were actually created by earthquakes along blind thrust faults. Tom Davis and Jay Namson are oil geologists who had spent years making underground maps of Southern California. In their quest to find new sources of petroleum, Namson and Davis started looking for ancient hills that over millions of years had been hidden by other rock formations. The process had made the landscape appear flat, disguising the source of oil and the earthquake hazard underneath.
This was a very novel idea for the earthquake community, that there could be large earthquakes on faults that don't come to the surface. And to us, we had already been predicting those things throughout California. We just didn't realize the impact that it would have on seismic hazard studies in Southern California.
Okay, that'll be location 1.
To confirm their theory about hidden hills and the faults beneath them, the two geologists needed to know what the Earth looked like from the inside out.
It's Saugus. That's right.
So they began gathering information both above and below ground. Rock samples, along with the use of sound waves detailing the Earth's inner structure, helped them compile cross-section pictures 15 miles below ground. The pair began finding blind thrust faults in areas never considered to be at risk for earthquakes. And one of those blind thrusts appeared to run directly under downtown Los Angeles.
The moment of realization of this large fault under Los Angeles came when I really got all of the well data together, and to me it meant something as far as there had to be a very active large thrust under downtown Los Angeles that no one knew about.
Davis had never imagined Los Angeles could sit atop such a massive and potentially dangerous fault.
And I spoke to a number of geologists at that time, and everyone was amazed, and the implications were clear to everyone within that, it was probably a few-week period, that if there really was a fault like this under downtown Los Angeles, it had some fairly serious implications as far as seismic hazard.
Davis originally called his discovery Fault A. Scientists later renamed it the Elysian Park Fault. And today, many consider the Elysian Park to be the city's most serious earthquake hazard.
The Elysian Park Fault could produce a really horrible earthquake. It could also produce a lot of north ridges, and we don't know. We don't have enough data right now, not because we can't know, but because the work just hasn't been done yet.
In 1987, just a few months after the discovery of the Elysian Park Fault, Los Angeles got a first-hand look at its destructive power. A small section of the massive fault snapped just 18 miles from downtown Los Angeles in the suburban community of Whittier.
In 1987, we had the real wake-up call for the Los Angeles area. We had the Whittier Narrows earthquake, a magnitude 6, really a pop on the record compared to Northridge. Nevertheless, on a blind thrust fault in LA, that's when we realized that LA is essentially sited on a set of knife blades. There are faults down there which we hadn't realized. And what we now have done is to look back around the world to other sites with similar conditions and see that earthquakes of magnitude 7 to 7.5 occur on these blind thrust faults, and so they presumably occur here as well.
All of a sudden, there was a major change in the way the earthquake hazard threatening Los Angeles was perceived. It was clear the entire city was crisscrossed with blind thrust faults, and even moderate earthquakes along one of those faults could be highly destructive.
What this has led us to is the inescapable conclusion that we're not looking at one big one. we're looking at a number of different potential big ones. And I think that does represent a shift in the way we've appreciated seismic hazards in LA in the past few years.
After the Whittier earthquake, Los Angeles began taking stock of the seismic threat lurking beneath its landscape. Today, experts believe that the city sits atop as many as 100 active earthquake faults, some of which hide beneath the most recognizable real estate in the country.
A lot of them go nearby some very famous landmarks. Groundman's Chinese Theater is just a couple hundred feet south of the Hollywood Fault. Capitol Records building, very distinctive building, downtown Hollywood, is just south of the Hollywood Fault. The fault runs right through Beverly Hills, through downtown Santa Monica. Dodger Stadium in the hills just northwest of the high-rise district sits above a fold that's formed above a blind thrust fault that goes right underneath the high-rise district of downtown LA that you see in the credits of LA Law. There are faults all over metropolitan Los Angeles.
To learn just how active these faults are, Jim Dolan has been digging in some of the city's most vulnerable areas. Underground, Dolan looks for evidence of movement along the faults.
What I'm doing here is called paleoseismology. Effectively, that just means the history of earthquakes, or the earthquake history of a specific fault. What we do is we dig trenches like we're in right now and look for beds that have been offset by earthquake faults. And we try, from various patterns that we see and the way they're offset, we can determine where earthquakes have occurred in the sedimentary record that we're looking at.
The beds Dolan is examining are actually layers of the Earth's crust, piled up over millions of years. Sometimes embedded within these offsets are deposits of charcoal, left over from ancient brush fires. During an earthquake, the fault jolts the land upward and knocks the layers in the charcoal out of alignment. By dating the deposits of charcoal within each offset layer, Dolan can determine how long ago they were displaced by an earthquake.
By doing that, by getting the age on these deposits, we can develop a history of movement on these earthquake faults by how the beds have been offset.
This information tells Dolan how frequently faults tend to erupt, which he hopes will help him forecast future earthquakes. Many of the faults under Los Angeles haven't snapped in several thousand years and appear overdue for an earthquake. High levels of stress may be building under the city. Eventually, this pressure has to be released in one of two ways.
Either we can have a number of Northridge-sized, San Fernando-sized, magnitude 6.7, moderately large earthquakes, or we can have a much larger, although much less frequent, earthquake, possibly magnitude 7 or larger, on one of these faults within the metropolitan area. Both of those scenarios are equally plausible, given what we know about faults in LA at the present time.
Recent history seems to indicate that a series of moderate earthquakes is well underway. Over the past 25 years, Los Angeles has been rattled by a series of 10 moderate earthquakes. That cycle began in 1971 with a magnitude 6.7 shock in the San Fernando Valley. It was the first significant earthquake to strike LA since the Long Beach disaster in 1933. It was followed by a cluster of 9 more earthquakes that include the recent event in Northridge.
We are averaging one damaging earthquake in Los Angeles every year for the last 6 years. And we don't know what that means. We don't know why it's happening. But it is happening, and when you have a lot of earthquakes, you tend to have a lot of earthquakes, which means that as long as we continue at this rate, we've got to say our chances of another earthquake in Los Angeles in the next few years are pretty good.
Ross Stein thinks it's possible that some earthquakes may actually trigger other earthquakes. All tremors relieve stress along the fault where they occur. But Stein wondered if that stress somehow transferred its energy to other faults nearby, pushing them even closer to their breaking points. He created a computer model of LA's recent earthquake cluster to illustrate how stress seemed to shift after each event. What emerged was a butterfly pattern that seemed to suggest a cause and effect relationship among many of those quakes.
Now in this picture, we're plotting regions where the stress dropped in purple and places where the stress rose are red. And you can see that the stress dropped on the San Fernando Fault itself, but the stress has been transferred to its surrounding in this butterfly pattern. And of the two southern wings, you can see that one of the places where stress increased was the site of the future Northridge earthquake 23 years later, and the other one was the site of the future Whittier Narrows earthquake, the next largest shock to occur in the Los Angeles Basin area that occurred in 1987.
According to Stein's theory, all this stress being passed from fault to fault has created a condition where one earthquake can activate another, perhaps accelerating seismic activity in Los Angeles.
Now, are any of these stress changes enough to cause an earthquake? No. They're very small. If, on the other hand, you imagine that all of these faults are stressed up to near failure, then these small changes could be important, and they could direct us to the places that have a higher probability of rupturing next.
The Northridge earthquake appears to have transferred its stress in 4 different directions. Along one of its paths lies a fault of special concern. It is the largest under the city and one that hasn't ruptured for centuries. This fault may be close to its breaking point, and it runs directly under downtown, the Elysian Park Blind Thrust Fault. The Elysian Park Fault is at least 35 miles long, running under some of LA's most densely populated areas. It could snap in sections, causing a series of smaller quakes. Or it could explode all at once, launching a massive magnitude 7 or 7.5 quake directly under downtown Los Angeles.
The possibility of a magnitude 7.5 earthquake occurring directly beneath metropolitan Los Angeles the consequences would be truly devastating. Remember that for every unit of 1 you go up on the magnitude scale, you're releasing more than 30 times more energy. A magnitude 7.5 is 32 times more powerful than a magnitude 6.5. So a magnitude 7.5 earthquake underneath metropolitan Los Angeles would just be enormously more powerful and enormously more destructive than a Northridge type earthquake.
The possibility of such an event has spurred the state of California to commission a study anticipating what emergency crews might face. Damage is estimated up to $100 billion, while the number of people killed could total 5,000. Dick Andrews is director of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. It's his job to plan for disasters, but also keep them in perspective.
Obviously, it would be a catastrophic event. But again, if you take all of the numbers of people injured, the potential numbers of fatalities, and then you consider that, again, there are 15 million people that live in the Southern California, the Los Angeles metropolitan area. You're talking about a very small percentage of the overall population.
This is how the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake outside San Francisco looked. The shaking at the epicenter lasted for approximately 12 seconds. A magnitude 7 quake under downtown LA would shake twice as long.
And that means that a building that is fatigued by being shaken for a short period would be much more threatened by that longer period of shaking. So the difference is probably most important in the duration, how long everything is exposed to that strong shaking, as opposed to the shaking itself being stronger.
The impact upon LA's downtown skyscrapers is hard to gauge. Built to comply with the nation's strictest building codes, for years steel frame structures were thought to be flexible enough to withstand any kind of shaking. but they too may be in jeopardy. The aftermath of the Northridge earthquake revealed a subtle yet potentially disastrous problem. Welded joints holding together the metal beams were found to be cracked in over 100 steel frame buildings. John Hall, a structural engineer, was among the first to realize the grave implications.
Some of the buildings which we previously thought were going to survive the earthquake without much trouble, the steel buildings, are going to have problems. Severe damage, some of them are going to collapse.
Hall worries if the welds actually come apart, some buildings could tip over, as happened during the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. Studies are currently underway to prevent a similar scenario from happening in California. Los Angeles has over 2,000 miles of gas and water pipelines. If sections of this vast network rupture, a volatile mix of fire and water could spread over an area 6 times the size of the Northridge disaster. Southern California's coastline would face an entirely different kind of hazard, resembling what happened in the seaside community of Niigata, Japan in 1964 during a magnitude 7.4 earthquake. A magnitude 7 earthquake could churn LA's beach communities into a sea of mud, endangering hundreds of buildings and homes. According to a study commissioned by the state, 750,000 people will be left homeless after a magnitude 7 earthquake along the Elysian Park Fault.
People ask me frequently, where can I go in LA to get away from earthquakes? Should I move? And I think that's the wrong question. It's not a question of trying to get away from earthquakes, it's trying to learn to deal with them.
Earthquakes are a never-ending story in Los Angeles, and the city's resiliency depends in part on the action taken before the next one strikes.
Clearly, you're never finally ready for something like that, but you simply go with what you have. You know, when the emergency occurs, I like to cite a kind of takeoff on an old phrase of John Lennon's when he said, you know, life is what happens while you're busy making plans. We've discovered here in California, disasters are what happens while you're busy making disaster plans. And so you can't just focus on the plans, you got to be able to execute those plans.
The study of earthquakes is still a relatively young science. Ironically, what little is known about the Earth's seismic secrets can only be advanced through each successive quake and the clues it leaves behind.
So we feel like we're on the hunt of a process of which we know too little about, and Northridge is really continuing that story. Maybe we've seen a structure by which we can fit together this sequence of large earthquakes that we've had. Maybe not. We're sniffing around, but we're terribly short of all the clues that we need. In a sense, we've got a few cards, but we're never dealing with the whole deck.
But with every tremor comes new understanding, not only in Los Angeles, but in earthquake zones throughout the world.
Many of the major cities of the world are located in sedimentary basins similar to that of Los Angeles and may also be having problems with blind thrusts, and they just haven't had the study to figure that out. So we have the potential here for helping not only Los Angeles but the rest of the world.
While science slowly expands its understanding, seismic pressure continues to build underneath Los Angeles, pushing its thrust faults ever closer to their breaking points. With all eyes now focused on Southern California as the world's seismic laboratory, the question is no longer if an earthquake will strike, but how soon.
a production of WGBH Boston. Funding for